There are really three things that I dislike about bye weeks when it comes to fantasy football. Number one, it's when I'm playing somebody in a matchup or I see a matchup in a league that I'm in where somebody doesn't bother to reset their lineup with those bye weeks, taking players on a bye out of their starting lineup and in a lot of cases replacing them with players on their bench that aren't on a bye. That makes no sense to me. People, set your damn rosters. If you're going to do fantasy football, then do it and actually try the entire season. It doesn't take that much effort. It really doesn't. The second thing that frustrates me about bye weeks when it comes to fantasy football is when I see people with starters and backups with the same exact bye week, especially at positions like quarterback or defense and special teams. I don't even advocate having a backup at either one of those positions, but specifically at those positions where traditionally you only start one person or one, you know, player, if you will, at that position week in and week out. Why would you have a starter and a backup with the same exact bye week? Knowing in part of the reason you took that extra quarterback or that extra defense and special teams was to cover the bye week. Again, that makes no sense to me. But the third and most frustrating thing for me when it comes to bye weeks in fantasy football is seeing how they're treated. That bye weeks are viewed as critical as they are, and I think it couldn't be further from the truth. Now, look, I'm not sitting here and trying to totally go in the face of all previous fantasy football logic, even though some fantasy football logic is outdated. There are still fantasy football experts that believe the best path to victory in a draft and in a league is to draft running back and running back in the first two rounds, and that just clearly isn't the case. That is a very outdated 80s, 90s, early 2000s philosophy that some people still try to perpetuate. The times change, fantasy football changes, and you get this whole emphasis every year of you got to pay attention to your bye weeks when you're drafting. You can't draft multiple starters with the same bye week. What are you going to do this week and what are you going to do that week? And it's always been viewed that the best fantasy football player will sit there and be able to spread out, let's say in a standard league format, with a quarterback, maybe two running backs, three wide receivers, a flex player, defense, special teams, a kicker. So 9 total starters and 7 bench players. The philosophy or the best ideal approach is to play it out where maybe you have no more than 1 or 2 starters on a given week out because of a bye. And that's always been viewed to be an ideal thing. And if you have 3 or 4 starters out on a given week, that's a bad thing. And you failed as a fantasy football drafter and you failed as a fantasy football player. And I sit there and I say, look, you're talking about 9 different starting positions. Okay, let's say you balance it out in that 9 different weeks, in terms of buys throughout the season, or how many weeks there are of buys. I believe it's a total of 8. Let's say out of those 8 weeks with buys, only 1 week do you have 2 starters out, and every other week you're only missing 1. That sounds great in theory, except when you realize that for close to 2 months, close to half of the season, and in particular, an entirely critical stretch in the middle portion of the season where you should be worrying about setting yourself up to make the Fantasy Football League playoffs and maybe worrying about seeding and potentially getting a first round bye, which is critically important. You're sitting there and you're playing with less than a fully stacked deck for 2 months. Ultimately, there's a reason you drafted these individual players at these individual positions and your defense and your kicker, what have you. You drafted them for a reason, to be your premium players, to be your starters. You wanted to have your team be the team, if you will. You wanted them to be at full strength as much as you possibly could. So why sit there and handicap yourself and have to deal with something for a 2-month stretch of time where every week you're having to replace somebody, every week you're having to take somebody out and put somebody in? It just makes no sense to me. And granted, I used to believe in this. I used to feel very strongly about this, that this was the way to go. But now as time has gone along, my philosophy and perspective has changed a little bit on this. And I think that if anything, the wisest thing to do for the bye weeks is very simple. I will say I do agree that if you're going to have starters with the bye week, by and large, your backup shouldn't have the same bye week. Because what's going to happen is when that starter has a bye week and you go to a backup and they have the same bye week, you might be forced to make a roster move that you didn't want to necessarily make, cutting a player you necessarily didn't want to cut, all to fill a spot that you shouldn't have had to fill because you didn't pay attention to your starter and your backup player, let's say, having the same bye week. Like I said, especially with the quarterback or your defense or special teams, but this even goes for like running backs or wide receivers. So you do need to pay attention to that. And you also do need to make sure you update and set your dang rosters and pay attention when those bye weeks come up throughout the season. But this whole notion of spreading out the bye weeks to me is completely ridiculous because are you really going to sit there? Let's say, for example, and I'm just going to throw names out there just as an example. Let's say in round one, you take Adrian Peterson as a running back. And then let's say in round two, you feel that clearly the best running back on the board might be, let's say, Arian Foster. Okay. But Arian Foster, in theory, had the same bye week as Adrian Peterson. Are you not going to take Arian Foster if you feel he's the best running back that's going to score you the most points and is most worth the draft position in the second round because he has the same bye week as Adrian Peterson? Are you going to worry about 1 week? Or are you going to worry about the other 12, potentially if you make the playoffs, 13, 14 or so weeks of the season? If you're going to allow bye weeks to dictate your entire draft philosophy, in particular when it comes to your starters, then maybe you're in the wrong game when it comes to fantasy football. Same thing here. Let's say in the first round you took Megatron at wide receiver, but then come around in the second round, you thought Brandon Marshall was the guy, and you had the chance to take Brandon Marshall. If Brandon Marshall is the same bye week as Calvin Johnson, are you not going to take Brandon Marshall for that 1 week because of that 1 week? No. And I think you're completely ridiculous if you do so, because again, you want to have that optimal team for as many weeks as you possibly can. And oftentimes there is way too much focus on 1 week instead of the other 12 of the regular season and 2, 3, or 4 weeks of your fantasy league playoffs. To me, I want to look at where I can get the most impact the most number of weeks. And I want to look at the big picture. I want to look at the entire season, and I want to sit there and set myself up well for the playoffs as well. And focusing so much on starters not having the same bye weeks to me is completely ridiculous. If anything, I would advocate, while not necessarily going out of your way to do it, doing something where maybe all 9 of your starters have the exact same bye week. And now some of you might sit there and say, well, that's completely stupid. You're basically giving up a week. In theory, you might be. But you're only giving up 1 week. All the other weeks, you're at full strength. While everybody else is having to make waiver wire moves and they're having to put their scrubs in off the bench and they're praying and hoping, you've got all your starters and you're raring to go. And for every week except one, you're off to the races with your full strength squad. And even on that bye week, you still have the potential to fill 7 of those 9 roster spots with bench players. So potentially, if you face a really weak-ass opponent or you get a hot week from a couple players on your bench, you might not be giving up a week at all. You might even potentially be winning. I've seen it happen. I've done it before. I know it can happen. Now, while I sit there and say you don't want to draft specifically for that bye week, because again, I think drafting all of those players with the same bye week is the same type of narrow-minded 1 week focus as on the flip side. The point I'm bringing up here is that you don't want to overvalue the bye weeks. You don't want to overrate the bye weeks. You don't want to sit there and allow 1 week in these cases for these different positions to determine what you're going to do for an entire season. If you sit there and you see that your 2 running backs and 2 of your 3 wide receivers that you really want to draft and you end up drafting have the same bye week, fuck it, who cares? So be it. That's why you draft backups with potentially different bye weeks, backups that could come in and fill these voids that you would need them to do at a specific time. Don't worry about it. Don't stress out about it. Don't overrate these bye weeks. Like I said, I guarantee if some of you got it to work out, where almost all of your fantasy football roster, your starting lineup, had the bye weeks the same week, yeah, you might sacrifice something that 1 week, but you're full strength pretty much the rest of the time. Or even if you were able to manage it where it was half of your lineup was out 1 week and half of your lineup was out the other week, you might not really be giving up anything at all. Yes, you might have to put in some of the scrubs off the bench and be hoping and praying, but again, you're minimizing the impact and the potential damage caused by those bye weeks. And I don't think anymore that the best philosophy is to sit there and try and spread it out starting in week 4 all the way to maybe week 10 or 11 and have 1 or 2 players out on a bye week each and every single week. You're taking stars, potentially, you hope that you draft the right stars, out of your lineup each and every single week. And it's just going to cost you. And you're going basically a month, maybe 2 months, a huge stretch of the fantasy football regular season at less than full strength. Why do that? If I'm going to be less than full strength, I want to be less than full strength for as minimal amount of time as possible. I want to have my full starting lineup together if I can work it that way, and it makes sense to do it as much of the season as possible. So if I have a time every fantasy football league year, every fantasy football draft, if I could sit there and I could get all of my starters to have a bye week, if it works out that way, where it's a 1 to 2 week window and everybody's on a bye, and then we get on with it and I've got my starters the rest of the time, then that's what I'm going to do. I'm not going to sit there and avoid drafting players because this running back number 2 has the same bye week as my running back number 1, or my wide receiver 3 that I want to take is going to have the same bye week as my other 2 wide receivers. No, that's why you draft backups with different bye weeks. That's why you sit there and play the waiver wire when you need to. You can do all these things and overcome the bye weeks. But again, the most important thing of all is don't overrate these bye weeks. Don't let them consume you, and don't let them dictate to you what you do in the draft, because when you do, you end up looking kind of foolish.